Hey everyone, we are continuing chapter 17/18. This is actually the chapter 18 part. We are talking about the autonomic nervous system. We've briefly mentioned what it was back in chapter 14 when we introduced the nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is part of the efferent output part of the nervous system. We've talked about somatic motor nervous system, which I'll recap here on this slide, on slide 8. And then we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system. So, recapping what we just talked about in the previous video about the somatic motor nervous system, when you have somatic motor neurons, you're controlling skeletal muscles. You have two neurons in this pathway. Let me draw the first neuron in pink, our upper motor neuron. Starting in the brain, it's going to be multipolar. Let's say we're controlling a muscle in our arm or leg, so far past our neck. So the axon is going to continue down the spinal cord. It may or may not decussate in the medulla oblongata, but it's going to synapse here in the spinal cord, in the ventral horn. And then from there, I'll draw our lower motor neuron in green. Multipolar neurons starting in the ventral horn, exiting out the ventral root, synapsing onto a skeletal muscle. Two neurons in this pathway. Look at the cell bodies of these neurons. The cell bodies of these neurons are either in the brain or the spinal cord. So the cell bodies of these neurons are always within the central nervous system. Because of that, you never have ganglia. The word ganglion, that is an area of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So these cell bodies are within the central nervous system. They are not within ganglia. There are no ganglia for the somatic motor nervous system. Also important to note that these axons are myelinated. Not all neurons have myelinated axons. Many of the sensory neurons are actually unmyelinated. It just happens to lead to slower, like milliseconds slower impulses. But to control your skeletal muscles, you have myelinated axons. It's one reason why if you have a demyelinating disease, where you lose myelin on your axons, one of the major symptoms you see is you lose control over your body, over your muscles, and potentially over your breathing. If you can't control your muscles, if you lose your myelination, you won't be able to control your skeletal muscles, and you can't move around or breathe, depending on which ones are demyelinated. So this is what's true for the somatic motor nervous system, which is part of the efferent branch of the nervous system. It's output. Similar, but very different to the somatic motor nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system does involve ganglia. And so we're going to have an additional neuron. We saw two neurons in that somatic motor pathway. There are three neurons, minimum three neurons in this autonomic pathway. So I just want to point out that we are keeping it simple in this class. If you take a neurobio class later on, you're going to learn all the intricate details of these neuronal pathways. But let's say, because this is autonomic, we're controlling smooth muscle, we're controlling the heart. The part of our brain that generally regulates homeostatic activities is the hypothalamus. I'm going to circle this in green. So we have our first neuron starting in the hypothalamus. I'm going to draw a multipolar neuron. I'm going to have the axon go down. Let's pretend we're going and controlling like the stomach or something. We're going to go down the spinal cord and end there. So there's our first neuron. This first neuron that I've drawn in green, it's an interneuron. It starts in the brain, it ends in the spinal cord. It's entirely within the central nervous system. So first one, interneuron. Our second neuron in the pathway, I'm going to draw in pink, has a unique name. It's not lower motor like what we saw before. We're going to call this the preganglionic neuron. Preganglionic because, well, it starts here in the spinal cord in this example. It might be in the medulla. We'll get to an example of that later. It exits out the spinal cord. It terminates here in a ganglion. Remember, a ganglion is an area of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. We saw a dorsal root ganglion in the sensory part of this unit, but these are motor, these are efferent. So these aren't in the dorsal root ganglia, these are in separate autonomic ganglia. There's a difference between dorsal root ganglia, where you have sensory neuron cell bodies, and autonomic ganglia, where you have these efferent neuron cell bodies. So our preganglionic neuron, its axon terminal, well, that's going to get even more complicated, but its axon terminal ends there in the ganglion. Where are these ganglia? We'll get to that. But they are outside of the central nervous system. They're not in the spinal cord or the brain. Also interesting is that these neurons are unmyelinated. Oh, sorry, those are the post ones. Let me talk about the post-ganglionic neuron. Let me draw that in blue. Post-ganglionic neuron starts in the ganglion. It also is multipolar, and it extends out and controls whatever it is you're controlling. Let's say I'm controlling smooth muscle of the stomach. This neuron is unmyelinated. So 3 neurons in this pathway. For simplicity's sake, we're starting in the hypothalamus, an area where a lot of homeostatic activity occurs, where we generate those signals. From the hypothalamus down to the medulla, if it's in the head region, or down the spinal cord, if it's head neck down. Within the spinal cord, it's going to be within an autonomic nucleus. I want to point out that while we haven't talked about autonomic nuclei, we have talked about which horn, which part of the gray matter it's in. It's going to be, how quickly can I draw this? It's going to be in the lateral horn. The dorsal horn is for sensory, second order sensory neurons. The ventral horn is for somatic motor neurons. Lateral horns are for autonomic, preganglionic neurons. So these pathways can control everything else besides skeletal muscle. We're controlling glands, we're controlling smooth muscle of all kinds of organs, we're controlling the heart, cardiac muscle. So we're regulating your cardiovascular activity, we're regulating your respiratory activity, digestive, excretory, reproductive. Lots of different things in your body are regulated automatically, without thinking, subconsciously, by this autonomic nervous system, by this type of pathway that we're going to dive in deeper here in a second. Now, if you recall, the autonomic nervous system can be divided into 2 parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic division, this is the nervous system that's activated when you are stressed out, when you need to exert yourself for whatever reason, when you're in a state of emergency, whether that's life-threatening or it just feels like it's life-threatening. So like if someone's actually attacking you, or if you just got really upset about your test, which I hope it's not the case, but those are all examples of things that can make your blood pressure go higher. It could make you breathe harder and have wider airways. It could make you have your pupils dilated. What I just circled there in blue, those are all things that it increases. So you're making your pupils bigger, you're increasing your heart rate, you're increasing your breathing rate. At the same time, though, you will decrease digestion. Digestion becomes a second priority, goes on the back burner. You want to focus more on delivering blood to muscles and getting ready for a stressful event, and worry about digestion later. So if you remember, our mnemonic for the sympathetic division It's the fight, flight, freeze part of the nervous system. You use it in times when you need to fight, when you need to run away, or if you just stay frozen still, not sure what to do, but you're all freaked out. That's your sympathetic division. If you remember, I said that we were going to have our first neuron in our pathway in the hypothalamus. Don't worry about the reticular formation. First neuron in the hypothalamus. So I'm going to draw my neuron here. It's going to go down the spinal cord and end somewhere between T1 to L2. What's really interesting is that preganglionic neurons, sympathetic preganglionic neurons, are only found within the range of T1 to L2. They're not found as part of a cranial nerve. They're not found as part of a pelvic nerve, which would be more caudal. They're only found between T1 to L2. The term for this is the thoracolumbar division. So our second neuron in this pathway, for example, will start here at T1. Now it's weird that I'm down here at T1, but what if I want to control my eye? I said that we can control pupil dilation. We can go up to a ganglion that's higher up. We can go superiorly, rostrally. And we're going to end here in a ganglion. And then from this ganglion, we're going to get another neuron, our postganglionic neuron, leading to whatever we're trying to control, in this case, the eye. Now, there are many different ganglia, and we're not going to go over all the different ganglia, but you'll notice in this drawing, let me point it out in orange. I'm going to circle it. Oh, that's not the best color. Let me circle it in black. There we go. All these things here are ganglia, or regions of neuron cell bodies. They're connected to each other. This is known as sympathetic chain ganglia. They're connected like a chain is. And this sympathetic chain ganglia, that's on both sides, so not pictured here would be it on the other side, but it's this chain of ganglia on either side of the spinal cord, and it's pretty close to the spinal cord. It's pretty close to the spinal cord. Why are these chained together? They're chained together. One major benefit is that it allows them to innervate several body segments so that we have more divergence, more spread out control. We just saw how if we start in the hypothalamus, we have to go down the spinal cord and then go back up to the eye. Counterintuitive, but that's just how it works. It's just how our nervous system is organized. And I'm sure there's some evolutionary reason that I haven't looked into. But by chaining the ganglia together, that allows the chain to move up towards the eye or to move down towards something like your kidney and urinary bladder. You're spanning all these different organs throughout your body by having a long connected chain. So the sympathetic chain ganglia allow for spread out control, diverging our postganglionic neuron towards whatever it is you're trying to control that's farther away. Now there is one unique ganglion besides sympathetic chain ganglia that I want you to know, and it's an unusual one because it's actually a gland. It's the adrenal medulla. The adrenal gland, let me back up. The adrenal gland is a gland that sits on top of your kidney. Ad means on top, renal means kidney. So literally means the thing on top of your kidney, adrenal. The word medulla, we've seen this before. The medulla oblongata is the elongated center portion of the brain. Medulla means center portion, the core of something. So we have the center portion, not the outside portion. The outside portion is cortex. The center portion of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, is a ganglion. It's a modified sympathetic ganglion. Here's how that works. Take a look at the bottom. We have our preganglionic neuron here in the lateral horn, exits out the ventral root, and it reaches our adrenal medulla. From the adrenal medulla, it won't activate a postganglionic cell, or at least not the typical one that we'd see. It activates a cell called a chromaffin cell. So we go from a preganglionic neuron activating a chromaffin cell that's only found here in the adrenal medulla. Chromaffin cells, they are modified neurons, modified as in they don't have any branches, they don't have dendrites, they don't have axons. So they're not going to be sending out neurotransmitter, but they do get activated by these preganglionic neurons. When they're activated, what do? They release hormones. They release the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. What's the difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter? Hormones are released into bloodstream. With neurotransmitter, we were just releasing over a small synaptic cleft, small area of interstitial space. This is into the bloodstream, into a blood vessel, where it can reach all over the body. Epinephrine can target your heart. Epinephrine can target your brain. Epinephrine can target your intestines. It can reach every single part of your body wherever blood reaches. So it has a very, very widespread effect. And we'll talk all about the endocrine system, but this is the gist of how hormones work. You release the chemical into the blood. That chemical is a signal molecule. It can bind to receptors, membrane proteins, in cells all over the body, if those cells have those receptors. So that adrenaline rush, another name for epinephrine is adrenaline. They mean the same thing. Also, if you haven't noticed, epi means on top, nephrin means kidney. So epinephrine means on top of the kidney. Adrenaline means on top of the kidney. They mean exactly the same thing. One's Greek, one's Latin. But anyways, yeah, that adrenaline rush that you get when you feel really freaked out, or you just did something really exciting, that was released from your adrenal gland, and it was controlled by the nervous system. So it's a mix of nervous and endocrine control to get that rush. Another big difference about these autonomic neurons is that for the postganglionic neuron, which is right here, here's the neuron cell body in a ganglion, its dendrites, axon. Now, rather than just having a single axon terminal, rather than it just ending like this, or even if it branches, still you have actual endings. It's not that. These are axon terminals. What we have instead are varicosities. Varicosities are where you have these bulged portions stringing along whatever we're trying to control. So in this case, smooth muscle. And at every portion, we're releasing neurotransmitter. So it's kind of like airdropping every step along the way. Here's some neurotransmitter, here's neurotransmitter, here's neurotransmitter, all along the thing we're trying to control. This further spreads out control. We have very divergent control here at these varicosities. Varicosities, once again, are these enlarged structures at the end-ish of these postganglionic neurons, and they branch out and have spread out control, allow for spread out control of whatever it is we're controlling, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. These are just for the postganglionic neurons. That was the sympathetic division. There are less similarities and some key differences between sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. The parasympathetic division, rather than being fight, flight, freeze, this is the rest and digest. So it's the complement. It does the opposite. What we saw previously is that pupils dilated. Here we get pupil constriction. We saw that airways got bigger. Here, airways get smaller. In sympathetic, we saw the heart rate go up. Here, heart rate goes down. So there are some negative decreased things that are happening. I don't mean negative isn't a bad thing, just we're decreasing activity. But we're increasing activity of things like digestion, increasing bile secretion, increasing your stomach movement, increasing secretion in your intestines. Those are all things that get increased. That's why we call it rest and digest. Rest because your heart rate's going down, breathing's going down, but we're increasing digestion. So I should draw an up arrow actually. I'm going to clear what I drew on the left side to make some room for more drawings. But also interestingly, remember the sympathetic nervous system? We started in the hypothalamus, and then we went down the spinal cord between T1 to L2, and then we went to the organ, or to the ganglion and then the organ. Here, we're still going to assume we're starting in the hypothalamus. So let's say we start in the hypothalamus. Here's our multipolar neuron. Rather than going to T1 to L2, we're going to either just go to the brainstem, or let me draw a different neuron starting in the hypothalamus, or we go down all the way down to the sacral division between S2 to S4. So it's almost like the opposite ends of what we just did with sympathetic. Rather than T1 to L2, it's going to be the very ends, cranial nerves and what we call pelvic nerves, so between S2 and S4, the craniosacral division. Another big difference, in the sympathetic division, we saw the ganglia close to the spinal cord. Here, let me draw a second neuron. I'm going to start up here. Second neuron from the medulla out to the eye, the ganglion is going to be close to the actual organ. So do you see our ganglion right here? This would be a cranial ganglion. And then the postganglionic neuron would be very short. Very, very short postganglionic neuron. And because the postganglionic neuron is so short, it's fine for it to be unmyelinated. Similarly, if I draw it in the example that goes in the sacral division, preganglionic neuron, let's say it goes to the urinary bladder, the ganglion is going to be right against the urinary bladder. So the next neuron is going to be super, super short. Really, really short. Let me label the preganglionic and postganglionic. This is preganglionic. And then this would be postganglionic. So parasympathetic division, craniosacral division, really short postganglionic neuron. Ganglia are really close or even within the target organ. And we still have those varicosities for the postganglionic neurons. Because we have discussed the specific nerves that the parasympathetic division uses, I would like you to know them. Because it comes from the brainstem, it uses cranial nerves. You know the cranial nerves, and there are 4 specific cranial nerves that have parasympathetic pathways. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, controls your pupil and your lens, makes the pupil smaller, allows you to focus. That's one pathway, using one parasympathetic pathway. Cranial nerve 7, your facial nerve, starts from between the pons and the medulla, exits and controls all kinds of things, including your tear production. That's what your lacrimal glands are. and also salivary gland production. There are different salivary glands. I'm not going to ask you to memorize them quite yet, but for future reference, it's the submandibular and sublingual glands. Cranial nerve 7 controls tear production and saliva production. Lacrimal gland, salivary gland. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, controls a different salivary gland. It's called the parotid. So here we have our preganglionic neuron and then our postganglionic neuron controlling a different salivary gland. Just a side note, all these ganglia have funny names that I'm not going to test you on. All these ganglia are, we're just going to call them cranial ganglia, because they're coming off of the brain. Those are cranial ganglia. Cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve, starts in the medulla, extends all the way down to your heart, to your lungs, to your liver, stomach, all of these different organs, intestines. Whoops. And then you have a very short, very, very short postganglionic neuron, which I'm just going to shorthand with a line here. So the vagus nerve is controlling many different organs, controls maybe like 75% of all of your parasympathetic output. Those are the 4 cranial nerves involved in the parasympathetic pathway. Your pelvic nerves, which come from that sacral division, S2 to S4. Pelvic nerves control your kidney, your rectum, your urinary bladder, genitalia. That's controlled by preganglionic neurons coming from S2 to S4. Hopefully you've seen that both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons systems can innervate, can activate or inhibit similar organs. We've seen, for instance, the sympathetic division dilate the eye while the parasympathetic division constricts the eye. Or one increases heart rate, one decreases heart rate. They can target the same organ. The term for this, when they target the same organ, that's called dual innervation. 2 things are innervating the same thing. There's dual innervation. And because they do opposite things, we can call that antagonistic control. Dual innervation, antagonistic control. It's kind of like a stoplight. When you come to an intersection, you see lights. If you see a red light, that tells you to stop. If you see a green light, that tells you to go. It's 2 different stimuli telling you what to do. Same thing here, 2 different nervous system branches telling that organ what to do, either to do something or to do the other thing. And they're always competing with each other, and whichever one is winning out, that's the thing that it's going to do. And there's different degrees as well. It can get pretty complicated. That's something you'll learn more in physiology for. I do want to point out real briefly, though, not everything has dual innervation. Blood vessels does not have dual innervation. It's only sympathetic nervous system. Your adrenal medulla, that special pathway where we saw epinephrine being released, that's only sympathetic. Your kidney, only sympathetic. Adipose, only sympathetic. Lymphoid tissue, only sympathetic. I think the ones that I'm going to focus on most are the first 2. Blood vessels are only controlled by sympathetic nervous system. So the size of your blood vessels, because there's smooth muscle lining the walls of your blood vessels. And then the adrenal medulla is only controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic does not control epinephrine release. So there's parasympathetic, there's sympathetic, there's somatic motor. There's actually one more division, and that's on the motor side, and that's the enteric nervous system. Enteric refers to your gut, your stomach, your intestines. And what's unique about the stomach and intestines is that it has its own nervous system, and it can have reflexes independent of the brain and spinal cord. Your stomach, so to speak, has a mind of its own. It can control when it secretes, control when it relaxes, without any input coming from your vagus nerve. So hypothetically, you shouldn't do this. You can cut your vagus nerve and your stomach will still work fine to an extent, but it can still function. It can still digest stuff. But of course, it can still receive input from cranial nerve 10 to work on its own, or to work and get input, but it could work on its own. These neurons are found in the walls of the digestive tract, this enteric nervous system. So we've been focusing on this, on pathways, both sensory and motor. And then in this chapter, this part of the chapter, we focus specifically on controlling things that are autonomic, not just skeletal muscle, controlling the stomach, controlling intestines, controlling the heart, eyes. These pathways, while they're not really easy for us to see with our own eyes, can be traced. So I want to have practice in the next activity of how do we actually go from sending a signal from our brain to controlling our arm, or how do we go from feeling something hot and sending that to our brain, and relating that to the anatomy, because when we damage different specific area of our brain or a specific area of our spinal cord or a specific nerve, that has consequences, and we can trace those consequences. We can predict that if we damage this nerve or this part of our spinal cord, we'll experience these specific symptoms in specific locations. That's the goal of what I'd like you to understand by the end of this. Before I end, I want to switch real quick to complete anatomy, just to show you where are these ganglia and where's the adrenal gland relative to all of this. If you go to the video section and just click on the nervous system, the main one that shows all of these different things, ignore the phrenic nerve that's dancing there. You can clearly see the spinal cord, but look next to the spinal cord. Let me actually label a few things. We're on the anterior side. Let me go to the dorsal side. Okay. If you look really closely, you will be able to see the dorsal root ganglion here. And then here's the dorsal root, and then here's the ventral root. Dorsal root, ventral root, dorsal root ganglion. And that, of course, repeats in every part along the spinal cord. But then if you look lateral of that, do you see these bulges, and then the connection, and then another bulge, and then a connection? And it goes all the way up and down. These are sympathetic chain ganglia. Whoops, sympathetic. Those are sympathetic chain ganglia. Clearing this. You can see the adrenal glands here on either side. Let me go back to the anterior view. Adrenal glands here on either side. If you can imagine that there's a neuron here in the spinal cord, this neuron extends out and ends at the adrenal medulla. And then from the adrenal medulla, we have a chromaffin cell that releases epinephrine. Into the bloodstream. Not shown here are postganglionic, or sorry, not shown here are parasympathetic ganglia. We can see sympathetic chain ganglia and the adrenal gland because these are very large things. The the ganglia for parasympathetic nervous system are always close to or next or really on the organ. So I would have to show every single organ, which I'm not going to do. But if you can imagine that there's a structure similar to this, but directly against or even within an organ, like within the heart or within the stomach, controlling that thing. All right. Thanks so much for listening. That's chapter 17, 18. In the next chapter, last one of the nervous system, we'll go over the senses. So I'll see you then. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.